Hi, my name is Chris Dowgan. I'm the owner of Salem Smuggler's Tour in Salem and also the author of Salem's Secret Underground and its sequel Sub Rosa coming out in October. And in this series we're going to talk about the series of tunnels within Salem, Mass. And the conspiracies to build them. Here's a picture of the old train tracks that used to be running right in front of Joshua Ward's house. Now a little bit further up the road you can see the original train tunnel. So there you can see the picture of Jerry's that would be in front of the Joshua Ward house that had a tunnel running to it. Now in the previous picture, and in this picture here too, you realize that the tunnel starts way past this point. That's because he didn't want to disturb Joshua Ward's tunnels by the train tracks. But by 1950, most of the smuggling was over. So there was no real worry about putting the current train tunnel in that runs the whole length of Washington Street, which would have disturbed tunnels going from one end to the other. In this picture is one of the banks to the right that was originally built by Stephen White. He had started his bank, the Asiatic Bank, on the lower floors of the East India Marine Hall, which is now part of the Peabody Essex Museum, and also his Oriental Insurance Company. He goes on to build this building and allows the Odd Fellows to have their lodge in it. Currently the building is still there, but they took off the top two floors and replaced them with a new third floor. Currently it had up to probably last winter, the Eastern Bank resided in that spot. Now, Stephen White had got together a bunch of different bankers in town and had them all decide to have their bank in this building, which is kind of strange because every other location they were at, they had tunnels attached to their buildings as well. So it still remains a mystery why they all had to settle on this one location. Now next to it is a Daniel Low building, which currently has Rockefellers in it. Originally it was the First Church, its building, and this was their fifth erection on that site. Now in the next picture shows you the old vault that's inside the Daniel Low's building. And you can see the door coming out the back that would lead to the alleyway if it wasn't bricked up. Previously to that being a service entrance, it was probably a backdoor entrance to this vault. There was a bank in the building before Daniel Low's bought the whole bottom floor and then eventually the whole building. And this would have been their vault. Today, Rockefeller's, the restaurant above, uses it to hide all their hard liquor so that their staff doesn't drink it while they're not looking. In the next picture, you can actually see the vault that would door that would keep the employees from drinking the liquor when they're not looking. Here is the building that originally stood on location here. This was the first congregational church in the country, and maybe even be said maybe one of the first churches in the country, or church building. So eventually this would be moved to where currently Walgreens is on the corner of Boston and Bridge. Now, this is the tunnel coming out of the back right corner if you're facing Essex Street from the corner of Washington and Essex, looking at the front facade of the Daniel Low building. Above, you could see every 3 feet, there's an archway with a metal rim. This might look very familiar if you look up, say, if you're traveling the Boston subway. This is probably the right amount of spacing for an arch to hold up, say, subway cars, or maybe cars driving above in the alleyway. Same thing we'd be able to see later at the Mason Lodge further up Washington Street, where their tunnel also went across an alleyway. Also, you can see to the left there a little nook where you could put a lantern down as you're trying to work your keys to get back into the building. Now, in the floor here, it said when Daniel Low had purchased the building, he had heard rumors that the state were coming in to commemorate all the buried souls that were underneath the floor of his tunnel. This was one of the many locations in town that when a runaway slave would die on the Underground Railroad, they would be buried. So Daniel Lowe, before the state could come in and turn his tunnel that ran to his warehouse that he moved goods back and forth to from warehouse to showroom, decided, well, I want to concrete it shut before they could commemorate them, forever fermenting or preventing any of the state from doing anything to commemorate these souls. So granted, in the future, it also becomes haunted as well. Now, right above that entrance in the last picture, is this metal plate with these glass circles in it. This is exposed to the sidewalk above. If you go in the alleyway behind Rockefeller's or Daniel Lowe's building, you will see a raised platform with a staircase going into the building. And just to the left of it, you could see this other side of this metal plate with the glass. Now, what this does in the tunnels is it allows light to be brought into the tunnels, usually around where the door to the building leaving the tunnel is. So this way you got light to work your keys. Now, this next picture is of me in the middle of that tunnel where all those poor souls are buried underneath from the Underground Railroad. In the next picture, this is the other end. This is the end leaving his warehouse. Previously, this would have been a building up to about a year or two that had the goddess treasure chests in the basement office. And this is the third building of that the first church erected on the location. Now, in front of it, the little sign coming out of above its doorway, that was the building that during the Revolutionary War, when the British invaded Boston, John Hancock took the state government and actually held court in that building for a month or two. Now, the train tunnel, before 1950, this is where it began. And I guess you could say that maybe they built this train tunnel to alleviate traffic problems on the corner of Essex and Washington Street. As you can tell, there's a whole lot of cars, and imagine all the accidents with that much traffic. And this is actually the other end. Very tiny tunnel. It's coming out currently near where the Tabernacle Church is on Washington Street. Well, a little further up the road, above that train tunnel to the right, is a Kinsman building. Currently, Opus and the Little French Bakery resides in there. Now, John Kinsman, he was the superintendent of the Eastern Railroad. Now, the Eastern Railroad was originally owned and founded by George Peabody. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. Now, what Kinsman planned was that the back of his building would have 8 tunnels, 8 separate tunnel systems that were running through town, connect to his building, and one tunnel, this one in the picture, leading out toward the front so that everyone in town, if they didn't want to sell their goods within Salem, they could actually smuggle it onto this train and either bring raw goods to build the new cities Lowell and Lawrence. They could bring the goods to Boston to further bring the goods maybe to New Bedford or the rest of the country. Also, there's one sad note about this train tunnel is that now if we had these runaway slaves coming through Salem, part of the Underground Railroad, they would be trying to, look for employment. Maybe not all of them wanted to go to Canada, and they could maybe be tempted by some unscrupulous few. So if you could get this far in the tunnels, how hard is it to say that somebody might, take 1 or 2 of them, or a couple hundred or 1,000, put them on a train, and bring them up to those new mill cities and work them in sweatshops where they could never complain? Well, it's never been written, so there's no real proof. But you can assume people would probably do that to another person, unfortunately. Now, and this is a tunnel that's running behind that entrance. So probably beforehand, before the Kinsman building was built, there was probably a building to the left of this tunnel and a building to the right. Now, it's just one of the many hallways underneath the Kinsman building. And also above, there is the corrugated steel that at one time was supporting a sidewalk between those two buildings. In the next picture, this is the largest sealed up tunnel entrance I found within Salem. So if you go to that bar Opus and go into the basement, hear a good band, get a drink at the bar, and then look behind the bartender. That's the largest sealed up tunnel entrance in town. So John Kinsman, and we see in this picture, he had a hell of a deal going on. And did many of these people end up in Lowell in this textile factory? They end up working in sweatshops. Who knows if many of them did or not? And were they sitting there toiling with these machines with very low labor and could never complain? Today, if you stand at the Salem train station and you look to your right, you can actually see into the current train tunnel. And it's a little hard to see, but right above to the right are these buildings. The county courthouses and the registry of deeds. All three of them will be connected by tunnels, and at one point connected to that train tunnel as well. This is a tunnel that's leaving the registry of deeds. I got to sneak in there one day when I wasn't supposed to be. And I was walking some distance until I come across a submerged room. Inside the submerged room, there was a man sitting at a desk. So I decided I'll walk really quick at this point so the man won't see me. So I did get to the Superior Court, and I didn't find a way to get to the other court that's on the corner of Essex and Washington Street. Also, I heard stories about a room. My friend, he had worked for the Registry of Deeds at one point, and he would get summer interns, these different women who would end up working underneath him. And he would tell them, I want you to go through that tunnel, and I want you to open up the door in the tunnel into the room. And your job for the afternoon is to go inside there and alphabetize all the photographs you find. Little did he tell them that the photographs were of all the murders that happened in Essex County. So he might not have been the friendliest at times. So about 2 years ago, they were doing some construction behind the Registry of Deeds, and this is what they exposed. So dead center, you can see the door of where I left the Registry of Deeds. And if you follow the picture on a 45-degree angle to the bottom left, you can see where that tunnel I had showed you previously was the top, in that room with the man who was sitting below in. And I didn't get to see that little room off that submerged room that could have led to where the photographs were, or maybe the tunnel that was leading to the courthouse on Washington and Federal Street. But afterwards, I was telling a friend this story about the man down in the submerged room. And he looked at me funny, and he said, "You idiot, that was me. And I was probably sleeping on the job, and even if I was awake, I would probably let you go in and see that tunnel." So, little do I know. Now, this is actually that mansion I was talking about earlier. This is the Pikmin Derby Brookhouse mansion. It's a mansion that Liza Haskett Derby had lived in while he was building his grand mansion where Old Town Hall is now. And you can see the 4 exterior chimneys on this house. So when the Masons bought the property to build their lodge, it came with tunnels already. They didn't have to build them this time. So this is a tunnel that would head off to Line Street or Lindy Street. I never got that right yet. Now, this other picture here, above is where at one time there was an alleyway, but now it's a 1-floor partition that connects to the building where the Griffin Theater is at this point. So you can see those arches up in the ceiling. Like I said, it would be in subways or it was in a tunnel at the Daniel Bose building. And a funny story about this door here is the woman who has shown me it. If you could barely see it in the top right, there's a latch that pulls down. Well, it was rusted. And I gave a good 5 minutes at trying to open up that latch there to open up this door. And the woman finally looked at me and said, "Oh, don't worry, we could just walk around this wall and you can see the other side." Here is the original Lyceum building. Now, the Lyceum was a building where the average person could come inside and get a education. So people like John Quincy Adams would do talks about politics. Hawthorne was a secretary booking everybody. His father-in-law, Dr. Peabody, was selling the tickets. Longfellow would come and do readings here. James Russell Lowell would read Dante's Inferno for one of the first times in English. And also, the Salem Boys Fraternity would be in this building after the Lyceum leaves, which is kind of funny or strange, since this was the only building out of the 3 different buildings in town that they resided in and during those days that wasn't made out of bricks. I mean, the first time they stumbled upon it, the first building was made out of brick. This would be in their second one. And they learned to put the kids back in a brick building again, because they did actually create Inferno in this building and burn it down. So James Russell Lowell wasn't the only person who had an Inferno inside this building. One of the other famous people who would do lectures here was Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass was invited to town by the Ramonds. Now, the Ramonds were famous in the abolitionist circuit inside America and in Europe. This is a picture of the sister Sarah Parker Remond. Sarah would own a hairdressing salon in her day in Salem before she leaves to go to Europe. Her siblings would also own laundries. Her father had owned Hamilton Hall, the most famous caterer in town. In total, her family had 10 businesses in Salem, them being African American and part Arawak tribe, the same tribe Tituba is from. The Arawak tribe hail from Curacao, an island off of Venezuela, and also made it off to Barbados and the other Caribbean islands in that area. Also, the Redmonds had hosted the first African American woman who ever went off to get a college education. Now remember, Sarah was a hairdresser. And Frederick Douglass has always had these amazing hairstyles. So I think Sarah knew him even in his later life. Now, to be amazed, you should see what her brother's haircut was. Now, it's funny. The first time I'd seen a picture of John Remond, I was walking off. After I found a photograph of him, I was walking to the Hawthorne Hotel, and I still had the picture in my hand. And I go in the Hawthorne Hotel, and I see these feet of my friend coming down the stairs. My friend is also born in the Caribbean, just like John Remond was. And he also was working, especially that day, as a caterer. Well, Remond was, raised in his father's catering company. Now, when my friend's body came to sight, where I could see his head, he decided to shave half of his afro off that Halloween. So I thought to myself, if there is reincarnation, I think I found out where John Remond ended up in his next life. Now, John Remond, he was also the recruiter for the 54th and 55th Regiment that is famous from that movie, Glory, with Matthew Broderick. Now, this is the Jacob Rush storefront. Today is Cabot Wealth Management resides in it. You can see the 4 exterior chimneys again. This was the first brick storefront that was connected to the tunnels in town. Now, it reminds me of a story where I grew up in Whiting, New Jersey, out in the Pine Barrens, where we're famous for blowing up the Hindenburg. There was a Chinese family up the road from me, and they would stand on their property waiting for a bus. Every time this Chinese family would sell a house to another Chinese family, they would actually get the Chinese restaurant as part of the deal. Now, the only thing cooler in Salem was that once you buy a house and it's connected to a business, it really was connected to a business, because Jacob Rush's house which is on Essex Street closer to the Salem Library, is actually connected to this building through tunnels. Better deal than the Chinese got in my neighborhood. And here is one of the many tunnels coming out of that basement. Now, Jacob Rust's house was famous just by accident. For when they were filming Lords of Salem, the Rob Zombie's wife resided in this house to the right. So if you ever see the movie, this is the house she's walking in and out of, trying to get to her apartment where a couple of the murders and scenes happen and such. But to the left is Jacob Rust's house. And if you go behind the home and you'll see there's an elaborate L-shaped basement entrance, you just look down into one of the old tunnels, because why would you want a new hole in your building when you already have one? So you just take the roof of the tunnel off, put a staircase down, blocking the tunnel going any further in one direction, and you put a door into your home. Now you got a new basement entrance. Now the filming of Lords of Salem also went to the Green Lawn Cemetery. And inside the Green Lawn Cemetery is this chapel. Now, the connection between Jacob Rust's door and this chapel is that the back of this church has a Bilko door. Now, the thing about Bilko doors and basement entrances is that in these 1800 houses, they're not historical. They didn't have weed whackers. They didn't have lawnmowers. There was no need to have access to the basement from your backyard. So later on, when you did need access to these basements, you take, like I mentioned before, take the roof of the tunnel off. The staircase going down blocks the tunnel from going any further from your building, and you already have the hole into your home where the tunnel door used to be. So same thing inside this chapel. Its back door actually points off to where Joseph Cabot had bought property. Now, Joseph Cabot, he was the first mayor of the city of Salem in the 1800s, when it wasn't a town no more, and they decided to make it a city. Now, on the property where Joseph Cabot resided is now the Cabot Farm, and the road leading up to it is very badly humped from the erosion around the tunnel, leading off to the two houses at the end of that road. The road terminates into a marshy field, and the two parts that are always high and dry is what you can see of the tunnel mound cutting through it, which then forks off to either house. But be careful walking on this public road at night, because you might wake up the guard rooster. The llama doesn't mind if he sees you, but the guard rooster crows. Then you get the pickup truck that comes out of the house and up and down the road, wondering what you're doing walking on that public road past the public playground. By the time you get to the end of the road, the cop car comes out, wondering what you were doing walking on that public road. Now, back before the Cabots owned that property, it was Orne's Point, and it was Orne who had put Joseph Peabody and Eliza Haskell Derby to their trade. They started off in his counting house. And somewhere in his descendants, there was a widow who was afraid of losing that property on the river there with their smuggling tunnels leaving off from the houses. Well, someone of her family was digging in the yard and found a vein of terracotta. Now, this is around the time that everyone's building tunnels in town, and terracotta makes great bricks. So one of the people who ended up purchasing from her, of many people in town that would save her from losing the property, would be Timothy Pickering. That's Secretary of State of Adams in Washington. Well, he puts in an order of 250,000 bricks from the widow. Back when it took about 8,000 bricks to maybe make a house. So you gotta wonder where all those extra bricks were going. Now back to that chapel. The other tunnel would head off to the west. After you go down a staircase, leaving the chapel, you would enter this room. In this room is where they would put corpses in the wintertime. For the ground was too solid and too frozen back before you had earth movers and heavy equipment. They needed a place to store the bodies. And no one was using this particular part of the tunnel at the time, so they would put the corpses inside these little slide-in tombs here. Today, occasionally you might find maybe a weed whacker inside one of them, or just some random garbage. There's also a tunnel that went to the other direction as well, that left the building, made a little curve, and then lets you get up 2 steps of the staircase before it's sealed off. Above there was a greenhouse, but that tunnel led off to Manning's property, where Manning was Hawthorne's uncle, and he had owned part of that graveyard where it was his nursery. It most likely led to the house that he allowed Hawthorne's mother himself to stay in, on the edges of that nursery. Here is the old bank building that's on the corner of Derby Square and Essex. The last bank to be in here in the late 90s was Eastern Bank. Before that, it was Norm Kegg Trust, and then several beforehand. Now, the first one in here was the first bank in the county, the Essex Bank. They would leave this site, and then they would enter into the building, the old boys club as they call it, next to Red's with the high staircase. That was their building first. And then eventually the boys club got in there and they didn't burn it down because it was made out of brick. Another bank who entered this particular property in the photograph was the Salem Bank. Now the Salem Bank was founded by Edward Augustus Holyoke, and on the side note, he looks like my grandmother in drag. Now, I have a photograph of me sitting on my grandmother's lap, about the same age, same hair, same face, she's leaning on a table just like in this photograph here, or this painting. And where that quill is in the photograph of me and my grandmother is a lollipop phone. Now the funny thing between my grandmother and Edward Augustus Holyoke is that Edward Augustus Holyoke's father's name is Edward, his grandfather's name is Edward, his great-grandfather's name is Edward, his son's name is Edward, his grandson's name is Edward. There are people who wanted their children to be doctors named all the way up into the 1970s, named Edward Augustus Holyoke Smith or Edward Augustus Holyoke Jones. Now, my grandmother's father, you guessed it, is Edward. Her great-grandfather's name is Edward. Her father's name is Edward. Her firstborn son is Edward. Her brother, the first of her father's kids, was Edward. I have a cousin, Edjo, and he ended it. My grandmother was an RN. And Edward Augustus Holyoke was a doctor who trained 100 people in Salem. He was the first dean of Harvard Medicine, as I mentioned before, found in New England Medical Journal. And if there was reincarnation, I think my grandmother beat me to town. Well, thanks for watching. Hope you come back next time.